if you read the report of the Social Investment Task Force in 2000, you will read that I said we have to develop financial tools, innovative tools that are appropriate for those who want to improve society. And that challenge is really the challenge of the last 24 years for me. I discovered that the world was going in the direction of risk-return impact. If you wanted your whole economy to do that, then you had to have impact accounting, like profit accounting, to measure the performance of a company in delivering impacts as well as profits. If you say a company has 1 million tons of gas emissions a year, you don't really understand the significance of it. If, on the other hand, you say Exxon delivers $39 billion a year of environmental damage, all of a sudden you have an image in your head because you understand the importance of money. So the problem IFVI tackled was, how do we value the impacts a company creates? $40 trillion of ESG money wants to achieve risk, return, and impact without measuring the impact today. They can't do it. You're giving investors the tools to make better decisions. And if you begin to change the behavior of investors, then you change the behavior of companies and the behavior of our whole economies.
Sir Ronald, it's really nice meeting you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here with you.
You have often been referred to as the father of British venture capital and also as the father of social investment. But you were born in Egypt, and you were raised there for the first 11 years of your life. So for people who are not familiar with you, could you please describe your early childhood in Egypt and tell me about your father and mother and what your family life was like, just to give us a little bit of color so we know from where you've come from?
I come from Egypt. I was born in Egypt. My parents were born in Egypt. We're a Jewish family. Egypt was characterized by great relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and that's how I led my childhood until nationalism began to rear its ugly head. And in 1956, there was a huge international incident as a result of President Nasser of Egypt seizing the Suez Canal. The United States intervened and stopped an attack to seize the canal back by the UK, France, and Israel. And as a consequence of that, all British, French, and Jewish citizens had to leave Egypt. My family left, Scott, with 1 suitcase each and 10 Egyptian pounds. My parents lost absolutely everything. My mother had a British passport. Her family had had British passports for generations. And we were lucky, therefore, to be able to gain entrance to the UK. And so I arrived at the age of 11 in 1957 without speaking English in London.
And your father, what did he do in Egypt?
So my father started life working in a bank and then became an entrepreneur, set up his own import-export business. It did quite well, which is why he continued to believe that there was a place for him in Egypt. And he was very disappointed, of course, when everything collapsed. And my mother told me that he was trying on the plane out of Egypt. And my mother said to him, why are you trying? There's nothing left for us here, which history has shown. I think there are 8 Jews, 8 left in Egypt now. The community numbered 80,000 when I was a child.
Did you have good memories up until that period?
Yes, and I have kept very good memories of Egypt. It's led me to invest a huge amount of time, effort, and financial resources in trying to help Israelis and Palestinians reconcile their differences, chair the Portland Trust, which is a charitable foundation with offices in London, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah in the West Bank, which works on boosting the Palestinian economy to achieve a better standard of living for Palestinians and relieving poverty and creating equal opportunity on the Israeli side.
Were there any lessons you learned from losing your homeland that still influence you or your decision-making to this very day?
One is that life, Jewish people, is very uncertain. It was part of the rule at the time when you were expelled that you lost your nationality, and so you became stateless. There were very few countries that accepted stateless people. Brazil, Canada, and Australia were the three at the time, and members of my family went to Australia and to Brazil. My father, therefore, became stateless, and he became naturalized 5 years after he came to the UK. So the uncertainty, you talk of nomadic Jewish people, I lived it, and it reaffirmed for me the importance of Israel. And I've devoted a lot of my time and effort to helping Israel to develop into a modern, effective, and humane country, just as I've done for the Palestinians.
And then your experience when you arrived in England, you were 11, you said that you didn't speak English. I guess that must have been full of lessons for you adapting to a completely new environment as a 11-year-old child.
Well, it's very interesting. I think if you're a refugee or if you're an immigrant, probably your experiences are a bit like the ones that I had. So I went to an interview with the headmaster of a state school, a school without a very glorious academic record. And my dad said in front of the headmaster, trying to encourage him to recruit me to the school, if you take him, he'll be top of the class. Now, you can imagine as an 11-year-old who barely understands English, hearing those words and feeling the sense of responsibility to deliver what my father had promised I would do. In many ways, I was very lucky. I happened to be a good student. It made it a lot easier for me to do what my dad had predicted. I'd been a good student in Egypt. Incidentally, I went to a Catholic school where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were together without any sense of differences, went, or at least were invited to each other's religious services and so on. And so I was very lucky to be able to deliver on my father's promise to the headmaster, but also that there was an inspired history teacher there. And I'm sure in your life, Scott, there must have been a teacher who influenced you more than others. But Richard Farley said to me one day, "Cohen, you should go to Oxford." And I said, "Mr. Farley, how can I get to Oxford from Orange Hill Grammar School, which has never sent anybody to Oxford, or perhaps one person in distant memory?" And Oxford had very tough entrance exams. And he said to me, "I'll coach you for the entrance exams." And he did, and I actually got a scholarship as a result of my performance in the exams. And one of the people interviewing me, "Who coached you for these exams? Your school didn't even have a stream to prepare you for Oxford." And I said, "Richard Farley." And I owe him a great debt, and I looked for him after I left, a few years after I left. I found him 40 years later, 40 years after I'd left Orange Hill Grammar School. I went to visit him, and he said to me, "It's amazing that you found me. I've always been at the back of the queue." And, I guess for a teacher, very often that's your feeling in life. You give people their start, but nobody really comes back to thank you or to help you. And so I was very privileged to be able to have a relationship with Richard Farley for 7 or 8 years before he he passed away. So I've been very lucky, which is probably your next question. How did it shape my life? I think has shaped my life, because I think if you're helped in life and things work out for you, you feel a natural instinct and the sense of obligation to do the same for others. And just as you were helped, you want to help in your turn. And that set me off, actually, on the road to impact investment.
That was your first experience with someone who showed you what making impact is like. He impacted your life tremendously, huh?
Yeah, he transformed it. I mean, you can imagine arriving 7 years after arriving in England without speaking English, walking into the quadrangle of Exeter College, which was started in 1314. What sense of, of gratitude you feel for the country and for the school and for the teachers that got you there.
It's extraordinary. And then in Oxford, you studied philosophy, politics, and economics. Then you complete that and something interesting happens. You go straight from graduating out of Oxford to America to study at Harvard Business School for an MBA. Now, most people work for a few years before going on to business school, but you didn't. So why Harvard, and what motivated that decision to go straight into business school?
But why Harvard's a wonderful story, because I was lucky enough to be head of the debating society, the Oxford Union, and it's very time-consuming when you're president. You invite very prominent guests. Bobby Kennedy came to speak when I was president of the union, so I actually got to host him and speak with him. And after my term of office, I went back home. I said to my dad, what am I going to do with a degree in PPE? He said to me, why don't you go to Harvard Business School? Now, Scott, I'd never talked with my dad about going to a business school or going to America. But it seemed to me just like unbelievable idea. I said, you know what? That's a fantastic idea. And I picked up my phone almost immediately, because we had no means to pay for what is a very expensive education. I started to look for any scholarships that might fund my studies. And I discovered that the Kennedy scholarships had been given, but there was the Henry Fellowship, which enabled 2 students from Oxford and Cambridge to go to Harvard and Yale every year to study the subject of their choice. But you had to get it. So I was in time for the process. I went through an interview with the most brilliant of Oxford's minds. So Isaiah Berlin, Sir Maurice Barra, and others. Unfortunately, got it. And at that time, Harvard Business School was experimenting with taking people straight out of undergraduate studies. Subsequently, they corrected and went back to the idea that it's better if people have more experience. But I was lucky. It was just that period. And I arrived at Harvard, again, at a very lucky time for me. I arrived at the time when venture capital was just beginning to appear. And I heard a professor speak about how he had invested $70,000 in a mini computer company called DEC, Digital Equipment Company. It was going to go public, and he was going to make $100 million out of it. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a hell of a way to become financially independent. And so I resolved to become a venture capitalist. And it was very contrary to the ethos in classrooms at HBS. At that time, big was beautiful. The idea that young entrepreneurs without business experience and great ambition can somehow outsmart companies like IBM seemed ridiculous to most people. But to me, it seemed quite natural. Again, maybe because of what I had been able to achieve from scratch as a young person. it seemed to me if you wanted to be innovative and do really creative things, then young people had the type of minds that would enable them to envision a new future and different technologies, non-existent technologies. Whereas big companies would typically be prisoners of the things that had made them successful in the past. And so I decided that's what I wanted to do. I was recruited by McKinsey. Some of my partners in co-founding my first company were also students at Harvard Business School. So I worked for McKinsey for a couple of years, and then we basically set off.
So that was like 1972. And then you do, again, something counterintuitive. You leave a safe job at McKinsey to co-found this company, which I believe was called MMG for Multi-Management Group. You had the idea to do VC, but I think actually this was more on the advisory side.
Yes, a partner at McKinsey, Roger Morrison, a very famous partner in the UK office and the London office, said to me, "You can be a partner here. Why are you leaving?" I said, "Roger, I'm leaving because I feel the view is better closer to the precipice." And I suppose I was risk-seeking in nature, or by nature. And a McKinsey life where you could predict your path for a career of 20 years or more, in comparison with becoming a venture capitalist, founding your own firm, backing entrepreneurs to do ambitious things, just seemed to be less exciting.
What were you advising on?
There were no real startups to speak of at that time. So we were advising younger companies on their international expansion, usually involving merger and acquisition transactions. So we were mainly a corporate finance advisor, really. But it was a way for us to create a deal flow that we could take advantage of when we could get to raise a fund. And so we kicked off, as you said, in 1972. It took us 9 years of worrying about where the next paycheck would come from, basically, until in 1981 we raised our first fund in Europe, £10 million. About $15 million at the time. You compare that with the latest Apax fund, it's $12 billion. But at the time, it was the biggest fund in Europe, together with one of our competitors.
But it wasn't the straight line, right? In 1977, 5 years after you started, two of your partners had left, and then you joined forces with a New York venture capitalist called Alan Patrisoff. And his company was Alan Patrisoff Associates, which is where the APA of Apax comes from. And then I guess you and your other remaining partner, Maurice Chitnio, were the X in Apax.
We needed an international name, and we were moving from venture capital to private equity as well. And so we were looking for a name. Apax achieved what you said in the views of Alan Patricoff. It was Alan Patricoff Associates with X for international. It also means unique in ancient Greek. Apax in ancient Greek means unique. And so it was a way for both of us to feel, wow, we have a name that unites us now, that we can build up into a big global firm. And today, Apax Partners manages more than $80 billion.
The rest, I guess it's got quite a storied history under your leadership. Apax grew to one of the most successful private equity and VC firms. How would you say that this was achieved? I mean, what was your secret sauce there?
Yeah, I wrote a book about it 2 years after leaving Apax at the age of 60 in 2005, called The Second Bounce of the Ball. The notion is that everybody can see the first bounce of the ball, but it's much tougher to anticipate the second bounce of the ball. And that's what venture capital tries to do, right? You try to anticipate the future. You can see the PC come along, but then you have to anticipate what the changes are going to be that come from the PC and from software. And whereas a lot of people think, well, this is just going to change the computer industry, we're just going from mainframe to mini to desktop, you understand that this computing power is going to revolutionize everything. It's going to revolutionize every aspect of every business at the end of the day. And of course, when we began to see the cellular phone come in, and the original ones were big, heavy, clunky appliances, really, you could, if you looked forward, you could see that this was going to have huge implications. But many people said, why would you need a phone that you can take with you everywhere? And then when the internet appeared, you knew that this was going to change every business. And while you might not have thought through that it would even affect retailing at that time, it was very obvious it would affect, most businesses. So when you say, how was it achieved? It was achieved by bringing together a group of people who had an appetite for calculated risk, had an ability to look into the future, analyze the facts, understand what was likely to happen, created in their heads a microcosm of the world that corresponded to reality. So you had to create a very special type of decision-making capability within the firm. You had to bring people with great skill in different areas so that you have fresh points of view. When you had discussions on an investment, you had to make sure that there was faith that the decision reached was the best you could reach. So the people who might have thought you shouldn't make that investment didn't feel that somehow they'd been contradicted and felt disappointed. And we achieved all of that. And so we delivered a very good performance. And we stayed with our eyes firmly set on where the second bounce of the ball would be.
Now, Apax was pure venture capital and then private equity. But so far in this conversation, we haven't talked at all about impact investing or social investing or socially responsible investing or anything like that. You were doing straight up VC and PE, trying to hit sixes, trying to keep your eye on absolute returns, weren't you?
We set off at the outset saying, we're not going to invest in gambling. We're not going to invest in alcohol. We're not going to invest in weapon manufacturing companies. We're going to do everything in an honorable, transparent way. So there were values underlying it. But if you ask me, how did that impact side connect with getting into venture capital? I had a very clear sense of mission that by going into venture capital, I would be creating much needed jobs in the UK and in the other countries. We expanded to 10 countries or so while I was leading the firm, that we were creating jobs for people that otherwise would find it very difficult to achieve financial success in life, at scale. But I discovered while I was at Apax that while indeed we were helping people from humble backgrounds make a lot of money, if you looked at the total gaps in society, we were increasing the gaps because we were enabling some people to make huge fortunes and others were being left behind because they didn't have the education and the training or didn't happen to be in the two fields where you could make fortunes during my lifetime, which were technology and the finance that funded tech entrepreneurship. And so I said to my partners at the age of 53, I'm going to leave the firm at the age of 60 to focus on two issues, social issues and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I want to give myself 20 years to do something significant in these areas. And after me, everyone will leave at the age of 60. The firm will be run as a partnership. I will let go of my shares at a very low price, and everybody will do the same after me. So my motivation was always social in a way. I wanted to do good and to do well. And of course, when I began to connect in a professional way with how do you achieve social good, that experience as a venture capitalist was hugely relevant, because serendipity and luck affects all of our lives. I'm sure it affected your life and the lives of many people around you. In my case, while I was leading Apax, when I was 55 years old in 2000, I got a phone call from the British Treasury. It was the Blair-Brown government, saying, we've been very concerned about dealing with poverty in a better way. However much money governments throw at poverty, they don't seem to be able to make a dent in it. Would you have a look with a more entrepreneurial eye at how we can do a better job of dealing with poverty? And in 2000, I led a task force called the Social Investment Task Force. And what did I discover, Scott? I discovered that while in venture capital, we'd invented a completely new way of funding entrepreneurs. Never before had you had 10-year funds that don't pay anything out potentially for 10 years, where you can lose the whole of your money and make a multiple if you're lucky, backing entrepreneurs who don't have much business experience. We'd invented a new way of funding high-risk, long-term ventures for people who wanted to make money. And it occurred to me what we hadn't done was to bring investment alongside government spending and philanthropic giving to tackle social issues. And so if you read the report of the Social Investment Task Force in 2000, you will read that I said we have to develop financial tools, innovative tools that are appropriate for those who want to improve society. And that challenge is really the challenge of the last 24 years for me, because I set off to try and bring that financial innovation. And by 2010, we'd invented the social impact bond, which was the first time you had a security where the return depended, in that particular case, on reducing the number of prisoners going back to jail after their release. Never before had investors put up millions of pounds, £5 million in this case, in the expectation that that funding would lead to a reduction in the number of prisoners going back to jail, young prisoners, and that their return would depend on the number that got out into the world and into jobs and led normal lives instead of going back to prison. Now that's led today, another 14 years later, to $1 trillion market in sustainability-linked bonds and loans, where a company borrows money from the bond market or from a bank, but pays less interest if it achieves a social or an environmental objective that has been set. That financial innovation was the definition of a new financial approach to fund those who want to improve the world. And the road to impact investment from there went on to say, well, if you look at it in financial terms, what you're doing is, in a social impact bond, is you're balancing risk, return, and impact. In investment terms, you'd say you're optimizing them. You're achieving the best balance between risk, return, and impact. Well, if you can do that for security, why can't you do it for a whole economy? And when I was asked by the British government again in 2013 to lead the G8 Social Impact Task Force. The language had changed from social investment to social impact. I discovered that the world was going in the direction of risk-return impact. At that time, ESG investment was 13 trillion, while today it's over 40 trillion. And it became obvious to me that if you wanted your whole economy to do that, then you had to have impact accounting like profit accounting. You had to be able to measure the performance of a company in delivering impacts as well as profits. And that led me to this last leg of the past 5 years, which I think has just had the breakthrough we aspired for, of creating impact accounting, of cracking the code of measuring and valuing impacts in a similar way to profit.
And this is coming out of your work of one of your pillars of the GSG impact, which is impact, transparency, and integrity. And this project that you're referring to is the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, which I'll refer to as IFVI. And you know, Sir Ronald, we all need more acronyms in the financial services business. Can you give a high-level overview of what this initiative is about and describe exactly what's the problem that IFVI is trying to solve?
We're all aware of climate change. We're all aware that the climate is affected by gas emissions. But if you say a company has 1 million tons of gas emissions a year, you don't really understand the significance of it, right? If on the other hand you say, look, let's look at 3 fossil fuel companies. Exxon delivers $39 billion a year of environmental damage. Shell delivers 23, and BP delivers 13. Now, all of a sudden, you have an image in your head because you understand the importance of money. So whereas 1 million tons doesn't give you a frame of reference for the importance, when you're talking billions of dollars, you immediately understand it. So the problem IFVI tackled was, how do we value the impacts a company creates, the environmental impacts and the social impacts? Now, if I ask you that question today, Scott, probably your mind would go blank. You'd say, well, I don't know how the hell you go around measuring water and, water usage, water pollution, soil erosion, waste. Well, we worked out how. We realized you needed a big data set. You needed, for environmental, 100,000 or more values for 530 impacts across the world in 268 locations at least, because a liter of water in the Sahara or a cubic meter of water in the Sahara doesn't have the same value as a cubic meter in Manhattan. And if you had all of this information, then if you connected it to the emissions of a company, you'd have money impacts, environmental impacts, like the ones I described. And that's what we launched on September 25th during Climate Week in New York. 100,000 value factors. Now, if you had them on your screen, and by the way, it's open source, so everybody listening to your podcast, Scott, can download the database on their PC, use it free of charge. But if you're an investor, you'd probably go to your Bloomberg terminal or your S&P data feed or your MSCI data feed or your FactSet terminal. And on that terminal, you'd press a button and it would match all the facilities of a company, all its factories, warehouses, and all the disclosed emissions, water usage, water pollution, waste, acres of land which have been deforested, and connect them with these valuations according to their geography. And so you'd look at a company differently. It had sales of so much, it had costs of so much, and it had impacts of so much. Now, some impacts, like environmental ones we've been discussing, will be negative. Some, like the value of their product for consumers, will be positive. The employment they create will be positive. And so you'll begin to give investors the tools to say, you know what, if I have to invest in a fossil fuel company, I'd rather invest in the one that is moving in the direction of clean energy and creating the least damage, because someday, maybe after President Trump leaves office, we're going to get back to the fact that climate change continues to worsen, and we're going to have to tax companies to prevent them from continuing to pollute the environment, and we will reward companies through tax credits for the good impacts that they create.
So the idea of standardizing sustainability data and impact data and giving it a monetary value, of course, makes sense. It'll make it easier to compare companies, be easier to evaluate impact between companies. But when I think about how ESG metrics or impact metrics are currently measured or reported, and they're all so nuanced, what does this look like in practice? I mean, how does this not end up being another footnote buried somewhere in an annual report?
What's going to shift the behavior of companies, because companies are the ones that create impacts, not governments, is the behavior of investors. When investors have access to information that enables them to measure in a reliable way the impacts companies create alongside the profits, you're going to change the values of companies, because investors will shift to the companies that are doing the best job of delivering both profit and impact, because of what we've just said about regulation and taxation in the future, but also because a lot of consumers don't want to buy the products of companies creating harm, and a lot of talent doesn't want to work for companies that create harm. So the attempt now to push back on anything that doesn't have to do with profit will lead to the pendulum swinging again in the direction of solving the big challenges we face. You can't solve them by ignoring them.
Well, the devil's in the detail. You mentioned all these data. So, for example, like a carbon footprint is currently measured by tons of carbon emissions. So when you convert this to a monetary value, is this framework referencing the price of carbon? Or is it something like current carbon price versus current tons of CO2 in a given time frame?
No, the price of carbon we've arrived at on the basis of the best scientific knowledge available is $236 a ton of carbon emissions. And you have the same for water usage, water pollution, soil erosion, and so on.
For a multinational company, does it take into account regional differences?
Yes, because they're GPS locations that give different valuations in different parts of the world.
So I'm picking on carbon because it's something that already has a market price that we can easily discuss. I'm trying to keep things simple, maybe so simple that even someone like me can understand this. How does the process work for more obscure metrics where there isn't a quick reference or a common value, maybe something like, I don't know, employee training or community impact? How do you approach monetizing these more intangible types of metrics?
So health and safety at work, you can look at the economic benefit of people not being injured, right? There's the cost to the health system. There's also the cost economically to their being out of work, etc. So you're measuring the economic dimension rather than the total human dimension of the problem. The same would apply for diversity. If somebody is excluded from work for ethnic reasons or gender reasons or whatever, it's a cost to their community. So if you look at the percentage of the population of a certain ethnic or gender background that is employed versus the community demographics, you can apply a salary level to the difference between the two. And then you get a dollar figure that says Amazon has a diversity debit of $6.5 billion a year, and Apple has one of $2.5 billion a year. But if you take it as a percentage of wages, Amazon is at 16.5% and Apple's at 25% diversity deficit. So you can measure the economic cost or benefit, even in terms of health in a food product. If you're consuming sugar, there's scientific evidence of the cost to health of consuming sugar. If you're eating grain, there's a health benefit to eating grain. These figures exist. So in a way, what we have done at a time when there's increasing transparency on quantity metrics is to bring the valuation part of it so that you can translate it into money and compare it with profits and across different impacts, social ones, environmental ones, and so on.
But in order to make companies comparable and their impact results comparable, everyone's got to be using the same values.
Correct.
So how do you envision this? Is this something that there's going to be one central body globally? And so how do you ensure accuracy and that everyone agrees these are accurate?
So you do it in the same way that we do for profit, because when you calculate the profit of a company, you have standard accounting policies for every company, irrespective of size or sector. You can depreciate your equipment over a certain number of years. For example, every company has to follow the same rule. It's called generally accepted accounting principles. We're going to have generally accepted impact principles. That's what we're building. And so 2 organizations in the world are responsible today for the standardization of financial accounting. One is the SEC in the United States. The other one is IFRS in the rest of the world. Now, the SEC was engaged in environmental measurement, and now the Trump administration is rowing back from that. But IFRS is progressing in 192 countries to standardize quantity metrics, tons of carbon, cubic meters of water, and how you measure them and so on. And we are bringing the valuation to whoever wants the valuation. So over time, you would expect IFRS to incorporate our value factors within their rules, within their principles. So every company would observe certain financial accounting principles and certain impact accounting principles.
So who do you see as the primary users of this methodology? Are you primarily targeting companies for their internal decision-making or investors making allocation decisions?
It's a bit like technology at the beginning, when some people thought this is going to only be applicable to the computer industry. The microchip is going to transform the computer industry only, right? Today, I think you're going to see uptake of this impact information first by investors. $40 trillion of ESG money wants to achieve risk, return, and impact. Without measuring the impact today, they can't do it. You're giving investors the tools to make better decisions. At the same time, you're giving companies the ability to improve their impact performance because you're giving them a measurement tool which helps them to satisfy the expectations of investors. If investors are going to companies that have reduced emissions relative to their competitors, companies will invest in reducing their emissions. They're going to need to make a calculation about how much do I invest What benefit does it lead to in terms of emissions? And what's the effect going to be on my share price? So companies will pick it up. Apps for consumers will pick it up. You have apps now where you point your phone at a barcode on the supermarket shelf, and it tells you whether the product is good or bad for your skin or your health or your nutrition. Those apps will have, is the company delivering this product polluting the atmosphere more than its competitors or less? If you discover that company is polluting a lot more and the product is similar to another company is producing with much less pollution, if it matters to you as a consumer, you go to that product. So consumers will pick it up as well. Governments, by the way, will also pick it up because governments are trying to solve social issues, which is where our conversation started, right? With the Social Investment Task Force in 2000. But they don't have today a measure of the social impacts that companies create. They know how to incentivize the creation of profit through taxation, tax credits, investment, and all the rest of it. They don't know how to do that for social impacts. Well, now they will know. They will know what effect the company is having on the population it serves. And they will be able to incentivize behavior that helps to achieve a better society. For example, if you look at the pharmaceutical companies today, some of them are borrowing in the sustainability-linked market, which is $1 trillion, to which I referred earlier. The rate of interest they pay on their borrowing falls if their pharmaceutical products reach more vulnerable populations, poorer populations, within developed countries and outside. So all of a sudden, governments have visibility on what they're trying to incentivize, and they can begin to give out tax credits to the companies that are doing a good job in the social area. But if you say to me today, if I had a magic wand and I wanted to put a priority on one of these groups, which would it be? It would be investors. Because investors are the lifeblood of capitalism. Capital is the lifeblood of capitalism. And if you begin to change the behavior of investors, then you change the behavior of companies and the behavior of our whole economies. And instead of creating problems, our economies begin to deliver solutions to our environmental challenges, but also to our social challenges.
So what kind of resources would an organization need to effectively implement this type of impact accounting to make this methodology accurate and effective?
The answer is not a lot more than they have now, because they're already being asked by myriad different agencies to publish their carbon emissions in different forms at different times, measured differently. It's a disaster for companies. There's a huge bureaucratic burden that is placed on them. When you bring them valuations in addition to that, you make it a lot easier for them to say, look, we're going to have one metric, one valuation. You're going to have a dollar value or a euro value or a yen value or whatever as an investor or as a government to look at. It also makes it much easier when the regulations come in, as they've been coming in Europe, to say what's material, what's important, what's not important in terms of the impact created. Now, you can say what's important is whatever affects your revenues or your profits, more than 5%. You don't have to go through 100 different criteria explaining the importance of it and why it shouldn't be taken into account and should be taken into account. So in terms of reporting, disclosure, and compliance, it will facilitate things.
And you think that there'll be support from independent bodies to audit this as there is today for GAAP and all that?
I think in the United States now for the next 4 years, we're going to see pushback on this type of thinking. But an American company working in Europe is still going to have to abide by European regulations, likewise in Asia. And the world isn't going to stand still with respect to this, because there are investors everywhere in the world who believe that climate change will just continue to worsen, and we have to be prudent.
How likely do you think supporting regulation will be introduced to make this type of reporting mandatory? And would something like that be essential to make this truly transformative?
I think it's going to be driven by markets more than governments. Let me explain. Rather than government policy, it's going to happen, in my view, in this way. The data we've been talking about, valuation metrics of quantity on different impacts, is going to become much more accurate and much more widely available. Investors are going to use it, and it's going to affect the valuation of companies. Regulators have to maintain, as you were saying earlier, a marketplace where everybody has access to the same information at the same time. You can't disadvantage people because others have better access to information. So when the information is out on the Bloomberg screen or whatever, the regulators are going to have to start looking at it and standardizing. And then eventually, government can have policies and so on, but the regulators will be the ones who will make it mandatory to abide by certain principles in calculating your impacts and valuing them.
Sir Ronald, I'm just thinking out loud here. There's heavy emitting sectors in our economies which are vital for everyday life. I'm thinking about things like aviation or manufacturing. And the companies in these industries will probably screen disproportionately negatively versus a company from so-called lighter sector, maybe like high tech, for example. Is there concern that this could inhibit investment flowing into these sectors? And then this would occur at a time when they especially need investment to decarbonize. So I guess I'm just trying to think through any negative implications for this and about how a poor profile company might adapt to reflect more positively under this model. Or is there some way your accounting model reflects this?
Brown to green, which is the transition you've been referring to, is an investment strategy today. Like finding an airline that is going to move earlier to using hydrogen and reducing its emissions may lead to a higher valuation for that company, because travelers are going to prefer to fly on it than to fly on a higher pollution aircraft. And so you can expect to see innovation coming into all these different sectors. And what we've found is there are leaders and laggards in every sector, whether, very high pollution sectors, even fossil fuel companies, as we were discussing, there are leaders and laggards. In transport, there are leaders and laggards in terms of environmental. In construction, there are leaders and laggards. There are some people who have taken this seriously and have thought this is the future. We have to be ahead of the curve. We have to anticipate the second bounce of the ball, which is the consumers and talent and investors and so on will not want to be involved with high pollution companies. And therefore, we have to make investment to reduce our emissions. And there'll be the others who were also around at the time when technology came, who said, forget it, this is all a load of baloney. Technology, whatever it is, never going to affect me. Same is going to happen with impact, Scott. You see, I don't think that young people are going to wake up now and say, wow, there's no climate change. I don't think that's going to happen. So young people's values are going to continue to drive them in the direction of working for these companies and consuming that product if, doing a better job of emissions. Now, it doesn't mean that investment dries up in polluting industries, because we need electricity, and electric utilities can't just be cancelled, right? So finding those that do a better job leads to a race to the top for the rest of the industry and catching up. Like, if you get one airline beginning to use hydrogen fuel and showing it's more efficient, costs less, and pollutes less, look at what Tesla did in the automobile industry. If environmental didn't matter to people, Tesla would never have got going. You wouldn't have seen a change in the whole of the automobile industry in the direction of electric, right? Why would you have $1 trillion company creating a vehicle that pollutes less? If it didn't matter to people, you wouldn't have got going. So I think we get confused. We think there are no consumer preferences. And we think, it's always going to be more expensive to do the right thing. Well, it isn't always more expensive. And you can innovate in delivering better impact as well as better profit.
Just to follow your line of thinking with the Tesla example, there's this new framework. Obviously, there's a positive impact, as you described, for less polluting vehicle. Does it somehow capture the implications of the batteries and the mining of heavy metals and the disposal afterwards? Is this all rinsed through in the end?
Yes, you have to look at all of the key components for manufacturing a car, and you can calculate the environmental damage that comes from mining cobalt and so on, and the disposal of the battery, all these things. Remember, we have massive computing ability now, and machine learning, and AI, and so on. We wouldn't have been able to achieve impact accounting without that, by the way. Without AI and big data, you couldn't have done this 10 years ago.
When you're talking about a company that's in transition from brown to green, does this framework monetize or calculate a positive impact when they're still in the transition? How do you account for that?
Today, if you have a company's projection, you have a graph, right? In year 1, we expect our sales to be here. In year 2, we expect them to be here. 3, there. You'll have a graph for your impact performance. Our emissions are here today. It'd be going the other way. In the future, they're going to be declining. And then the question is, what's the impact of this improvement in impact performance on our sales, our profits, and our market value? Let's take a food company whose products have very high sugar content today. If it begins to shift to selling health food, meaning fruit bars with no sugar in them, and these new products take off, what should be the impact on the company that continues to manufacture products that are very rich in sugar? Well, they're going to see a decline in their sales. In the same way that Tesla saw correctly, people want a vehicle that's at least as good as the one that exists today and that does not pollute. You're going to have people saying, we want food that's healthy as well as tasty. I think the disruption that comes from having transparency on the impact performance of a company will be the same as technology achieved. When you had two companies and one was using technology in reaching its customers and so on, and another one was saying, no, we're going to stick with the old way of distributing and selling and all the rest of it, you went to the one using technology because you thought they'll just do a better job more cheaply and be worth more. Same is going to happen with impact.
Then there's the flip side of this. You're implementing effectively new rules for the market to score companies by. You and I've both been around for a while and seen a lot of things. Enter the charlatans, and presto, We have a new age of greenwashing, or in this case, you might call it impact washing. Are there safeguards built in to keep companies from gaming this new system and having some way to look like they're in transition from brown to green when they're not?
So in financial accounting, you have exactly the same challenge, right? Everybody's trying to appear to have greater profits than they actually achieved, or greater sales than they actually achieved, so as to be worth more in the market. And you keep getting refinement every month. There are changes in accounting policies to make sure that you counter game and give a false view of your profitability. I mean, people don't realize, Scott, that before 1934 and the introduction of GAAP accounting, companies picked their own accounting policies. Each one could have a different one. There were no auditors to say, yes, these numbers are right. And companies could put part of their profit into a hidden reserve without telling investors. And after the crash of 29, investors started to realize we've been investing in companies without knowing what profits they're making. But it seemed perfectly normal to everybody. You could game that old game quite easily. Now, it's become much more sophisticated because you have, financial policies this thick, and you have auditors, and you have the SEC and regulation, and so on. And that's why we have big financial markets. We're going to have to do the same with impact. We're going to have to be savvy about making sure that the impact valuations and the impact principles that are being used are being standardized in ways that can't be gamed easily. And you're going to constantly be improving them in the same way that we do with financial accounting.
There's been a lot of tuition payments in the school of hard knocks along the way.
I don't think you can avoid having to close loopholes all the time whenever big money is involved.
This work of the IFVI grew out of a project at the Harvard Business School, and then it was expanded, if my homework's right, in 2022 to be a global initiative. What kind of challenges did you come up against when you started aligning a common IFVI methodology globally?
The big challenge we had was to show how you value impacts, and coming up with the answer. It's a global data set which takes different values in different places for water or erosion or whatever else. Once you've achieved that, you have to get this data in the hands of investors. As we said earlier, if you get it in the hands of investors, the regulators will follow. That's the big challenge today. Investors are crying out for this data. You see all the discredit now that's being heaped on the lack of measurement of ESG, right? You have to bring proper measurement to investors who want to know what the impact performance of a company is. So the big challenge now is to get this data widely disseminated through the big and small data providers. I think once that has happened, it's a watershed. Once 40 trillion of ESG money can have a reliable view of the impact performance of a company, then investors will use it. And then if you don't use it, you'll be left behind as an investor because it's going to affect company value.
Your work at GSG Impact, one of the things you've been lobbying for is a change from GDP being the sole method of measuring economic growth. Do you think it's possible to protect our planet sustainably and transition to a maybe more of a circular economy while continuing to aggressively pursue GDP growth in the way that it's currently calculated?
I think so. My view is that bringing risk-return impact today into decision-making enables you to deliver a higher investment return than ignoring the impact and just looking, as we've always done, at risk return. Look at what happened to the coal industry. If you ignored impact, you continued to hold coal assets and they went like that. There's now a word for this, stranded assets, right? It's going to happen in other areas too. Other companies are going to find their value declining because they're out of step with consumer preferences and talent preferences and investor preferences and regulators and so on. So today, if you look at my personal investment portfolio in venture, it's all in impact ventures. They're all companies that achieve good as well as profit. They're companies which previously you would have thought would only measure growth and profits. But they're measuring growth, they're measuring profits, they're measuring, if it's a software company, in the public transport area, commuter time, which hits more vulnerable populations, emissions that come from larger vehicles traveling when smaller ones would be sufficient at different times of day, or optimize the routes that shorten the time of travel. They measure the number of hours that a driver drives, and they measure the number of accidents. That's going to be the future. You're not just going to be measuring growth and profits, because your customers want more than that. Your customers, the mayors of cities and so on and so forth, are also concerned about pollutions and commuter time and accidents.
I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up here. You are such an inspiration. You've had a storied career. We discussed quite a bit your journey to found Apax, and then when you left Apax, you alluded to developing the first social impact bond. We didn't discuss it here, but you co-founded First Bridges Fund Management. And then the social impact bond was developed at Social Finance, which our mutual friend Adam Swirsky has been on the show previously. And we had a great talk, and I can include the links in the show notes. And then you went on to co-found Big Society Capital, which started to crowd social capital at scale. All of these organizations have been successful and have had long-term success based on your leadership. And I love the fact that you have traveled down so many paths that people might have assumed would have diverged. And yet somehow you found a way to make them converge into being a pioneer in social and impact investing and impacting untold numbers of lives because of that. So I just want to pick your brain before you go in an effort maybe to help others to embrace the same audacity that you've had to imagine what they might do with their life, much like you have. And I'd like to get your ideas and advice for different types of listeners, because there'll be some people out there listening right now who will be inspired by listening to your impact story. And some of these people might have more time than money right now. Maybe they're earlier in their careers, or maybe they're in transition now. And there'll be other types who are looking to have more impact and to make more impact with their own personal investments, like you just referred to. And then there's a third category, people who are already in positions within professional investment and asset management institutions. And I'd love to ask you for some simple next steps for listeners in each of these three categories. Like, what could people start doing differently tomorrow? And I'm asking this because I think it might often be easier for people to take the next steps towards impact investing from where they are at right now than they might think. And whether the form of investment is time, or it's money, or it's energy. But I think people often want to do something, but it often gets pushed into the someday I'll get to it category. And I think it's very easy to do that. And I don't blame anyone for doing that, because the easiest thing for every single one of us to do tomorrow is exactly the same thing that we did today. But to strike out and try to change things, you can quickly feel like you're stumbling through a fog if you don't have a clear direction, especially if we take an individual private investor. The idea of starting from scratch to try to figure out what makes a good impact investment is daunting. Could you speak to those three types of listeners? First, for the private individual investors, which could include a qualified high net worth investor or someone smaller who is maybe managing their retirement portfolio that they're investing for themselves. And then there's the professional institutional investor who maybe they don't have any product out there, or maybe they do. And then the third is those that have more time than money at this point in their life. Like, what could they do tomorrow or next week or next month? Of course, understanding this podcast is not giving investment advice, and I'm not a registered investment advisor and all that jazz. But I'd love to hear what you think some simple steps might be if someone is inspired by what you've told us today and they want to begin to get some skin in the game and get out on the playing field in life.
So, as I wrote in my book, Impact, 5 years ago, and there's a new edition just coming out, there's a role for every single person listening to this podcast to contribute to this impact revolution. Let's start with the simplest one. You're a consumer. You can just become more aware of the information that's available about companies supplying product to you. You can be aware of apps like Yuka, which started out as a French app in measuring the impact on your health or on your skin of a food and beauty product.
What's the name of this app?
Yuka, Yuka.
Okay, Yuka. Okay, I'll put that in the show notes.
Yuka today is used by more than 20 million shoppers in France, and I think something like certainly more than 10 million in the US, in shopping. So watch out for apps that tell you about what's good for you or what's good for the world in terms of the environment and society. If you're an entrepreneur, my motto is start young, think big, and stick with it. But I would add today to what I wrote in 2007, put impact at the center of your venture. It's the future. You want to build the biggest, most profitable company. You want to do what Tesla did in 25 years, become $1 trillion company. Put impact at the center of your venture. You're an entrepreneur. You have the ability to disrupt whole industries. Think big. Think big. You're working in a big business. In the big business, you have the ability to make your management leaders aware of the importance of impact in accelerating the growth and profitability of your company. You're an investor. Begin to use the value factors that we've talked about over here. Request them from your data providers. Begin to achieve the same transparency on impact performance that you achieve on profit performance. It'll be just as easy. It's a row of numbers on your screen. If you're working for a government, impact brings new tools for government, not just the transparency we've been talking about, but sustainability-linked bonds, social impact bonds, enable governments to raise money from the private capital markets to achieve social good and achieve government priorities at the time when governments don't have money. So whoever you are listening today, think of the role you can play in doing good and doing well at the same time.
You mentioned your book, Impact, and we didn't discuss it today, but
Impact, the subtitle is Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes where they can pick up a copy.
And there'll be a new edition coming out in the middle of this year. It'll update a lot of numbers in the book, but the thinking is the same. And you can get an e-copy extremely cheaply on purpose, because we want students and anybody else to be able to afford it.
As I said, I'll put a link here in the show notes where people can buy that. So, Sir Ronald, I just got a few last rapid fire questions to wrap up our talk. So give me whatever comes to your mind. If nothing does, feel free to take a pass. That's okay too. If you have to name the single most important challenge in the impact investing space at this time, what would it be?
Impact measurement.
What do you know now about impact investing that you wish you knew in 2002 when you co-founded Bridges Fund Management?
That governments and philanthropists would be slower to pick up the idea than financial markets.
You don't have to name names. We all like to discuss our winners, but can you describe to me an investment that you have made that you were convinced of at the time you invested? It ticked all your impact boxes, but in the end, it went pear-shaped. It didn't turn out. And what were the lessons learned from that?
So my impact portfolio is only about 7, 8 years old. I have not had a disappointment of the kind you've described yet. Most of the companies that I'm involved with, all of them, are led by entrepreneurs who really want to improve our world. And if that's how you feel, then you're going to deliver impact.
The converse of that, can you describe an investment that you had some level of skepticism, either at the time you invested or maybe you passed on it, and in the end, it turned out way better than you thought, and you were pleased you invested, or if you passed on it, you wish you hadn't, and was there a lesson learned from that experience?
I don't have, in the impact space, my history is much shorter than in the broader venture capital space. It's, as I said, about eight years. I have not found yet somebody who set off on the road and then discovered that they had the opportunity to grow their impact hugely, like a Tesla would have been that, right? Investing in Tesla in 2000.
If someone wants to get into the impact investing space, and I'm probably discussing someone younger than you and I, where would you advise them to start?
Well, the wonderful thing about the impact space is that it is meeting technology today in very powerful ways. There are some sectors like health and education where it's very obvious how you can deliver greater impact through a marriage of impact thinking and technology. But it applies in every industry. It applies, as we've discussed, in the food industry, in the utility industry, in the construction industry. Wherever you are, you can define a way to use impact to enhance the growth and profitability of your company while delivering public good.
Sir Ronald, you've been very generous with your time today. I really enjoyed it. I've learned personally a lot from our discussion. Is there a website for people to find out about all the different things you've got going on? Because you have way more, it seems, going on than just GSG Impact.
Sure. No, you can go to sirronaldcohen.org. You can have access to the other things I'm doing.
And for the IFVI, which we talked a lot about, there's a website for that?
Yes, indeed. IFVI, GSG Impact, two key organizations. GSG Impact works in 47 countries now.
And IFVI, is that .com or .org?
.org.
.org, and same for GSG Impact.
Yeah.
And the best way for people to contact you?
Through my website, Sir Ronald Cohen. .org.
Sir Ronald, thanks again very much.
My pleasure, Scott. I've enjoyed our chat. Good luck.
Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.